Are you suffering from rashes on your skin, sneezing, runny nose, itchy eyes, gut issues, bowel issues, headaches, racing heart, shortness of breath? You may have histamine intolerance. Let's find out more. Hello and welcome. All right, so today we're going to talk about histamine intolerance. And I think the first thing we've got to figure out with this is, number one, is it really an issue that you just have to live with? Because there are many people who have allergies, different sensitivities, especially that involve these histamine type symptoms that I'm going to go over. And it's just thought that, hey, this is just something that happens with some people, and you just take your antihistamines and you go down the road and you just live that way. But is there other answers? Is there other things that are going on here that are driving this? And this is really what's not investigated or looked at. It's just thought, hey, you just live with these things. But the other side of that story is, why doesn't everybody have allergies? Why is this not a normal thing in everyone's life? To dust or pollen or, things in our environment. Why don't they affect everyone the same? So again, we find out that this is not really about histamine, which histamine is part of our immune system. We have to have it. We need it. It's very important. And in fact, one of its big producers is a part of our immune system. It's called your mast cells, which are made by your bone marrow, and they react to things that our body's exposed to externally and internally. So when we start to be allergic to things in our environment to a large degree, where dust bothers me, pollen and just grass and things that now I'm allergic to all these different things. This is what we would see as more of an over response of the immune system, which means there's something else driving that side of the immune system. There's something else causing this increased histamine level in the body. And again, you can suppress that, but from our standpoint, it's like, wait a second, we can suppress it, but let's look for the cause. So I think the first thing we've got to understand is histamine itself. So basically in the human body, there's 4 types of histamine, and the first one is called H1. Now H1 does a few different things. First of all, it causes your smooth muscles to constrict. And what are your smooth muscles? That's your organs. So think about, organs such as your intestinal wall when it constricts, or the uterus when it constricts. And really, that's what's up here at the top is the uterus. And so what will happen is, if the uterus constricts, if the smooth muscles constrict there, it throws off the menstrual cycle. It throws off the menstrual period. This can cause more pain and cramping. This can cause more heavier or lighter periods. Now, if it affects the bowels or the gut, we're going to get some diarrhea, some stomach cramps or stomach aches, even painful gas. So again, this is more of these histamine type responses. Now, another interesting side note here is that histamine increases estrogen and vice versa. Estrogens increase histamine. So if you notice, it's always during the first part of my menstrual cycle, right before ovulation, that all my allergies flare up or my rashes increase, but then after ovulation, everything calms down. That would be more significant with this. Or if you're just estrogen dominant and it, because of a progesterone estrogen balance issue, that histamines increased at other parts of your cycle too. So very interesting side note there. Now the other thing is the mucus secretion. So mucus is a defense mechanism. When we have a runny nose with mucus, we think, oh, that's just because of bacteria or something like that. No, this is a defense mechanism. That mucus grabs onto things and tries to pull them out. We can get mucus in our throat, our lungs, our gut. In fact, in our gut, it can come up our esophagus, of course, into our throat. But also, some people have mucus in their stool. Hey, what's that about? That's the defense mechanism. That means your body's fighting something. So mucus is, it's a defense. And again, one thing that can occur with this too is bronchoconstriction. So actually, you start to constrict your bronchial tubes. What's that do is affects your breathing. Like if a person had allergic type asthma, which of course also shortness of breath can occur with this. Nasal congestion, runny nose, sneezing. These are all these more common histamine allergy type responses. And then the other thing it does is it causes your blood vessels to become more permeable. And what does that mean? That means they're more leaky. Things can get through the blood vessel wall and then get to your skin and your nerves, and then that will cause the itching feeling anywhere on the skin, the rash that can show up, or even welts or different skin symptoms, and then even flushing of the skin where it's like, hey, everything suddenly turned red in this area, and or I felt that flushing feeling. And then another thing that it does is it dilates the blood vessels. It can cause your heart rate to speed up or give you an arrhythmia. It can increase your blood pressure, and then you can get vertigo and an anaphylaxis. Anaphylaxis is a very bad histamine response, an extreme one, where of course, this could potentially cause your throat to constrict enough to where you end up in the emergency room, or your body swells up, your mouth and your tongue and your eyes swell up, these more anaphylactic type responses. So that's H1. Now H2, very similar in a lot of ways. Again, same thing we're seeing with this is the blood vessel leakage, also the bronchoconstriction, sneezing, shortness of breath, runny nose, nasal congestion, all that's the same. Again, with the skin, seeing the same things. Also on the cardiovascular side, we're seeing those same symptoms there as we saw with H1. The other interesting thing, though, is H2 increases what's called cyclic AMP, and another one I put on there called CGMP, cyclic GMP. And the thing is that what those do is they increase the bone marrow production of mast cells. So then you get this, hey, yeah, I've already got a bunch going on. Tell the bone marrow to make more, and now I've even got too much going on, and then mast cell levels increase and you get more histamine, and it just becomes this vicious cycle. Also, this will increase gastric secretions, and again, that smooth muscle contraction, and what happens there, again, same things, diarrhea, stomach cramps, stomach aches, painful gas. All right. Now we get to H3, the third type of histamine. Now this one totally operates different. This one operates more on your brain and central nervous system, and it actually affects the release of neurotransmitters to multiple areas of the brain. It affects acetylcholine, which is more focus, concentration, memory. It affects dopamine, which if that goes low, that'll make you feel irritable. Everybody leave me alone. If it's norepinephrine, that's adrenaline responses. If it's serotonin, that'll make you feel down, depressed, teary-eyed. And then histamine itself is a neurotransmitter. All right, so very interesting there. And then, of course, what are the symptoms? Well, some of those that I just mentioned, but also headaches, vertigo, nausea, vomiting. If it affects an area of the brain called the hypothalamus, that will affect your body temperature, your food intake, your appetite, your locomotion, learning, memory. Those are more going to be frontal lobes, prefrontal cortex, and then also can affect the circadian rhythms and arousal. So circadian rhythms, this is basically your sleep-wake cycle. So this can make you feel like, hey, I'm waking up a lot, or hard to fall asleep, or hard to wake up, or you'll start to see changes in that, changes in arousal, your ability to wake up in the morning and have energy. So again, all these things can be affected. And then we get to H4, which, H4 is still kind of under investigation. They haven't quite pinned down H4. They know it exists. They know it plays a part in a lot of different things, but they don't know exactly how. So this is still under a lot of research. So one thing we do know potentially it does is it also affects the bone marrow regulation and can increase mast cell secretion because it actually regulates hematopoiesis, which again, this is your bone marrow making blood cells. And then, like I said, more research needed. They're thinking, hey, this is involved in more of a chronic inflammatory response that kind of keeps inflammation going, and potentially more in autoimmune conditions. Now, the thing about it is you have these histamines, but they can all work together. They can all kind of cooperate and do different things, meaning that H1, H2, H3, these can be involved in this whole respiratory side of runny nose, nasal inflammation, congestion, sneezing, shortness of breath. H1, H2, H3, and H4 can all affect the gastrointestinal tract. So bloating, flatulence, feeling full, overly full after meals, diarrhea, abdominal constipation. Again, you see all these. And then the nervous system, that would be more your H2 and H3, headaches, dizziness, and some of the others that I mentioned earlier. And your circulatory system, speeding up your heart rate, low tone of vessels, and then collapse potentially. It could just cause you to pass out. And skin itself, Yeah, the H1, H2, and H4 on that one. And again, we can get itching, flushing, eczema, swelling. So all these things potentials with this. So then the next thing we've got to say is why? Why is this? What's driving histamine? Is it just things floating around in the air that's driving this whole thing? Or is that really an effect? Is that a response to external things because something that's driving the histamine? Absolutely. And that's the way we've got to kind of look at this. So here in the middle are the cells. And basically these are things that affect these cells and drive histamine into them. So basically, if we look at this, foods are a big one. In fact, before we say foods, let's go to one of the biggest, the gut microbiome. This is the good bacteria versus bad bacteria in your gut. We need bacteria in our gut. Those bacteria are scavengers. We have to have them. They kind of clean up all the trash. But again, if our immune system's down or inflammation's up, they start to grow out of control, and then we can get symptoms from that. The thing is they can generate histamine responses, and that histamine, of course, then gets pushed forward into the cells and then through the cells, and then that goes into our blood vessels and then circulates in our system. Not a good thing to happen when it's excessive. And so if the gut bacteria are off, it's going to be excessive. The other thing that I was mentioning a moment ago is foods. Certain foods increase histamine levels, and we'll talk about that more. In fact, after a while here, I'm going to give you a link to a diet, a histamine diet that works really well. Alcohol is a big one. Now, alcohol doesn't just generate histamine, but alcohol also affects the DAO gene. This is a gene that helps you to process histamine properly, and which we'll talk more about soon too. But if you inhibit that gene or decrease its percentage of function, yeah, absolutely, your histamine levels can stay up. Same thing with certain drugs. There's certain medications, pharmaceuticals that will affect that DAO gene and increase histamine. And then a big one here too is genetics. So some people have a genetic polymorphism, meaning their gene, their DAO gene, and some other genes already don't work at high levels. So, they already potentially have histamine issues due to that. Now, there's certain things you can do to help those genes, which we'll also talk about in part 2 of this video. And then the other thing too, if you're going through pregnancy, if you have malnutrition, if you have inflammation in your body, if you have an autoimmune condition, if you have the big C, any of those things can inhibit DAO or generate histamine. So again, and then it'll start to circulate system-wide. And then here's the next one here. And this one's super important because I would say 8 times out of 10, about 80% of the time, here's what I find in patients. Parasitic infections, candida issues. And we think of parasites as like these weird and wild things that you see on YouTube videos, but actually parasites are extremely common. I hate to say, if you look at food under the microscope, all kinds of little guys in there, eggs in there, we consume these all the time. But the immune system in our gut should zap them. And if it doesn't, they thrive and they start to generate these increased histamine levels, which absolutely can drive the responses that we get in our skin and our sinuses or reactivities to things in our environment. But also, same thing can occur with candida or different funguses that live in our system too. And candida, everybody has a little candida, but if our immune system's down or inflammation's up, it starts to thrive and grow. It's what we call opportunistic. So I do find that that's a major issue to solve when there is chronic histamine issues. And again, so very important to deal with those types of issues. So what I've done also here is I've added a diet that I think can be very helpful for these histamine issues. Now, before you start any type of diet or make any dietary changes, you should always talk to your doctor. But again, this is a diet that's set up to help with histamine issues. What I'm doing is there'll be a box that comes up, or maybe already up, that has a link on it on the video itself, or there's also a link below that you can click on that'll take you to where you can get this and download it real easily. But I think here's the thing with the diet though. To find out really if you have a histamine issue, if you go on this diet for 2 weeks and you notice, hey, I felt so much better eating that way, you probably have a histamine issue. If you're like, hey, I ate that way for 2 weeks, I really didn't notice anything. I didn't feel any better. I didn't feel any worse. Probably not a histamine issue. So again, this can kind of help you tell what is really going on here, because in the next video we're going to also give you some different supplements that help with these types of issues, and I'm also going to talk about other conditions that can mimic a histamine issue that you may find out, hey, I actually have this or that. So hopefully that gave you some great information on histamine and a starting point of something to do about it, and I'll see you in the next video. God bless.